Well, thank you, Matthew, for that kind introduction. Great to be here, and thank you for coming. Well, where to start? You've probably all been following the Synod and probably know quite a lot about it, but we'll go through it anyway, and hopefully I'll share some things which are quite new. So we've just had 1 month in Rome with plenty of acrimony and contention, lots of heat, and depending on who you speak with, not a lot of light. Eagerly awaited by some, thoroughly dreaded by others, the first assembly of the Synod on Synodality, on the theme for a synodal church, communion, participation and mission, is over. It took place between October the 4th and 29th, behind closed doors, under a kind of, I don't know if you know, the Chatham House rules, where it's really effectively in secret, but people can speak, but they can't say who said what or when. And carefully selected portions were shared with the media. It wrapped up with a lengthy 42-page synthesis report, magically written in the space of about 3 days, in which every paragraph, after amendments, remarkably passed with a 2/3 majority or more. Now, the assembly was plagued by controversy even before it began. There were questions over its legitimacy as a synod of bishops, questions that have yet to be properly answered, given that nearly 1/5 of the votes were for the first time from lay people, many of whom had distinctly modernist and heterodox perspectives. Then there was the Synod's Instrumentum Laboris, a working document that gave a fairly good idea of what those in charge had in mind when it came to synodality. The Synod itself, as you know, began in 2021 and concludes not until next year, but it was billed as an opportunity for the Church to reflect on its own life and mission following consultations with the people of God at a diocesan, national and continental level. Now, the overall aim of synodality, we've been told, is to foster a more inclusive, participatory and missionary church, a chance to listen and walk together as the people of God and welcome voices who have historically felt marginalized by the Church and in effect cast out by the Church's teaching. But to its detractors, the synodal process came over as simply a cover to introduce heterodoxy into the Church, whether it be the normalization of homosexuality, women deacons, radical change in church governance, and other issues that have long been favored by dissenters, but always blocked by previous pontificates. Coupled with bien-pensant statements that go down well with the world, the late Cardinal George Pell called the Instrumentum Laboris an outpouring of New Age goodwill. And as we've come to clearly see, voices upholding apostolic tradition were not listened to as eagerly as those pushing progressivism or even not at all. So what I want to do in this talk is really just give you a report on what happened, not in great detail, as I don't wish to put you to sleep. You probably know a lot already, but in order to allow you to make up your own mind as to whether this was a noble initiative carried out with integrity to help evangelization, or one that's been an exercise in duplicity and aimed ultimately at subverting the Church, our faith, and apostolic tradition. I'll then end by sharing some views from a few experts and theologians, which I think cut through a lot of the sophistry and tell us what's really happening. So I'll begin by taking a brief look at the synod process itself. Now, synodality, as we know, is an ambiguous term, perhaps deliberately so. And it's hard to even find someone to properly define it, or just to explain it with confidence. But what we're told by the synod managers is that it's a process of fraternal collaboration and discernment, one they maintain that bodies like the Synod of Bishops were created to express in the first place. Now, in a way, it is a way of living and operating in the Church that makes the communion between God and human beings tangible. That is synodality. Synodality means journeying together as the people of God, and we are told is a constitutive element of the Church. We are also informed that synodality is the process through which all her members can take an active part in her evangelizing mission. It's a way of listening to each individual person as a member of the church to understand how God might be speaking to all of us. It's also not to forget, let's not forget, about accompaniment, inclusion and welcome. Synodality, the organizers say, has implications for how the church lives together in community, serves those in need, and evangelizes. It's the form, the style, and the structure of the church, we've been told. Sister Natalie Beckhart, who's the Undersecretary of the Synod Secretariat, said it's about enabling people to participate, be protagonists, be a missionary disciple as the baptized. It's about carrying on the mission together. It's always for the mission, she said. Now, the impetus behind synodality, or at least the ostensible reason behind it, is the scandals, especially the sex abuse scandal, the falling away of the faith, and other manifold ways in which the church, or rather her members, have fallen short over the past decades, preventing souls from drawing closer to Christ through his church. Hence, this process of synodality, a widespread consultation through, though only 1% of the world's Catholics were consulted, let's not forget, is really meant as a means to renew the church, to concretely bring communion with Christ to a broken humanity so desperately seeking it. So this is what we've been told, and to put it that way, it seems fairly harmless and perhaps even noble. But as I said in my introduction, there were widespread and well-founded concerns leading up to the Synodal Assembly. And these were, I don't have the book now, oh, it's over there. These were perhaps best expressed in the book, The Synodal Process is a Pandora's Box by Julio Laredo and Jose Antonio Reta of the Tradition, Family and Property Movement. Now, as two Latin Americans well-versed in that continent's church politics and liberation theology, they described it as a revolutionary process that takes up old heresies repeatedly condemned by the magisterium. They warned that it was the work of radical minorities rather than, as synod proponents contended, the work of the Holy Spirit, and that they were advancing the same proposals they have put forward since the 1960s. The central intention, they wrote, is to question the very structure of the church, and their proposed change is so radical that the synod documents speak of conversion as if the church has been on the wrong path and needs to make a U-turn. They also quoted Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who denounced such attempts to upend the church's hierarchy, which the synod wants to do, as a delusion and would lack all legitimacy, and that obedience to it should be decisively and clearly refused. In the book's preface, Cardinal Raymond Burke was similarly forthright, saying that synodality and its adjective synodal have become slogans behind which a revolution is at work to change radically the church's self-understanding, in accord with a contemporary ideology which denies much of what the church has always taught and practiced. He added, it's not a purely theoretical matter, for ideology has already for some years been put into practice in the church in Germany, spreading widely confusion and error, and their fruit, division and indeed schism, to the grave harm of many souls. Close quote. Jose Antonio Reta told me that the agenda being presented wasn't hidden, but it was discreet, and not even bishops were aware of what was at stake, hence the need for the book. The book was therefore aimed at alerting the hierarchy to what Ureta called the heterodox serpents and lizards inside the Pandora's box that is being opened. Sister Natalie, by the way, clearly wasn't amused by any of this, and made a point of liking a post on X, showing the book in a garbage bin. By the way, I asked her through the Synod Secretariat if she'd like to meet Jose Antonio and Julio Laredo, and she never responded. So much for the listening that they were so busy talking about. So how did the assembly play out? Was it an authentic exercise in listening that genuinely welcomed all voices? Or was it, like so many of the synods of this pontificate, a vehicle for introducing heterodoxy? Now, in his opening address, Pope Francis claimed that the ongoing Synod on Synodality is what all the bishops of the world wanted. But is it? Let's first recall that the notion of synodality was imposed on the 2018 Youth Synod, and neither the word synodality nor the phrase synodal church appeared in its Instrumentum Laboris, the Synod's preparatory document. The youth taking part in the Synod had as much idea of synodality as any of us, and yet there it was inserted into the last chapter of the final report. So the plan for a synod on synodality appeared to have been born then, seems to have completely come out of left field, and it's a concept that's actually been around for a while, and it was somewhat proposed by the late Jesuit Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini in the late 1990s. Now, Francis told us in his opening address last month that a survey among all the world's bishops after the Amazon Synod in 2019 showed that synodality was their second preference. The bishops said this. Now, I may have missed it, but I don't recall, I don't know if you remember it, this survey, just of bishops and of seeing such results. But we know from Traditionis Custodes, unfortunately, that survey results during this pontificate really aren't reliable. In fact, quite a few of the assertions put forward by the Synod Secretariat and the Pope himself have turned out to be simply false. First of all, as I alluded earlier, it's not the Synod of Bishops in the way Paul VI intended, because for the first time laity have a vote. So 70 members in total, making up nearly 1/5 of the 364 voters. Now this is significant because, as in previous synods, only bishops and some clerical heads of male religious institutes had a vote, and a 2/3 majority was required for propositions or other motions to pass. So now, for example, if less than 2/3 of bishops voted in support of a proposition, the votes of the laity could bring that support to match or exceed the 2/3 mark, and so ensure that such a proposition would be passed. So in other words, although bishops might not support a proposition, laity can make it look as though they did, and that is likely to have happened last month. But it's not possible because, and we don't know, because the Vatican didn't give us a breakdown of how participants voted. Now this is especially concerning when one realizes that many, if not most, of the 70 lay members from all continents supported dissenting positions, and their vote carried the same weight as someone as theologically learned as Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Incidentally, I learned that representatives initially put forward to take part from one continent, I won't say which, just protect my source, who were also considered to be orthodox, were rejected by the Synod Secretariat on grounds that they hadn't taken part in a local synod assembly before. But this wasn't actually a stated requirement for choosing candidates. I was told that this seemed a convenient excuse to exclude those who were nominated but not part of the synodal club. So a little example of how the deck was stacked in the synod. Another problem for the synod is that now laity have a vote, canonists are arguing that it's not canonically valid as a synod of bishops, as there's been no change in canon law to allow for such lay participation. This therefore also threatens the body's canonical and theological legitimacy, something I was reliably told is of considerable concern to Cardinal Mario Grech, who is the Secretary General of the Synod Secretariat, who also was asked during one of the general congregations about this question, and he answered irritably that it was a synod of bishops and there was nothing to worry about. But for all the protestations that this was a synod of bishops when it clearly wasn't, Eastern Rite and Orthodox bishops insisted privately and publicly that it wasn't, due to the fact that the laity had a voting presence. Moreover, as Father Gerald Murray of EWTN, who you may know, he said that by allowing laity to vote, it ignores the essential distinction between the ordained and the non-ordained in the Church, and that Christ's establishment of a hierarchical church means that certain roles pertain to the shepherds that do not pertain to the sheep. Now, perhaps partly to make up for this illegitimacy, and in a way that revealed a clear determination to achieve a preset end, several bishops during the synod said they thought an agenda was clearly at work. And great emphasis was placed on the Holy Spirit. We are not the protagonists of the synod. It is the Holy Spirit, the Pope stressed in his opening address, and we leave room for the Holy Spirit, the synod, if we leave room for the Holy Spirit, the synod will go well. His address was filled with references to the third person of the Trinity, coupled with the implicit notion that disharmony, disagreement, or lack of consensus were not of the Holy Spirit. Now, not a few bishops and even some cardinals told me that they viewed this relentless co-opting of the Holy Spirit as sacrilegious. Then we've been told from the beginning of this 3-year process that it's not a parliament. But this too appears to be false. One bishop at the synod told me that for the entire month, he felt he was in some kind of debating chamber. Also, synodality really, when it comes down to it, is a byword for democratization of the church and the decentralization of the church's structures, all dependent on a vote of the bishops, some religious and laity. And rather like a parliament or debating chamber, this was apparent when there was hearty applause whenever a synod member spoke in favor of a progressive agenda, but little applause for orthodox statements, which I thought was quite telling. Now, true, the Synod of Bishops has no executive power, and it's supposed to be only a consultative and advisory body. And the final decision, of course, is always the Pope's, given in the form of an apostolic exhortation. But like a parliament, it is deliberative, and if the voting is to mean anything at all, then it has to have some influence on the executive. As Professor Stefano Fontana of the New Daily Compass wrote, with this structure, there is no doubt that the forms of democratic praxis of a worldly kind will enter into synodal procedures. They may therefore have said it wasn't a parliament, but to many it certainly seemed to resemble one. That's my comment, not his. Now, the assembly itself was very controlled, according to many I spoke to, especially regarding the time to speak. Every round table had a facilitator who would ensure that delegates stayed on topic and on time. Every minute is controlled, one bishop told me early on. The facilitators are watching everything all the time. So much so that he said two had to be cautioned for controlling too much and not facilitating. Now, each delegate got 3 minutes to speak in the general congregations, that is the plenary sessions. And so someone like Cardinal Muller had just that amount of time to defend the Church's teaching to the whole assembly. On the round tables, each delegate had 3 minutes to make their point about various points, and then all the others had a set time to respond to it. They then paused for prayer to reflect on what had just been said. One bishop estimated to me that only about half of the lay delegates were Orthodox believing Catholics, so about 35 in total. And that meant about one for each table, because there were 35 tables. The rest were pushing a heterodox agenda of some kind. I was also told that the Latin American and Asian delegates were generally all liberal, the latter sentimental and moved by emotion rather than the Church's teaching and reason. Most of the Africans tended to be solid. The European and US bishops were very divided, and almost all the Anglophone laity at the Synod were left-leaning. Now, the tables changed each week, with delegates assigned to different small groups, but it was interesting, I thought, to note that the seating of who was seated with whom. In the week that a women's diaconate was discussed, for example, some of the most vociferous advocates of women's ordination were put together with other women of the same mind. But it should also be said that some tables had a strong mix of different opinions and known voices. Now, before I go on, I should say that, and I think you may agree with this too, that many synod delegates found the assembly to be helpful, or at least it seemed to be potentially helpful. Several conservative bishops told me that they welcomed the opportunity to hear other people's views. Now, this isn't new, of course. At every synod I've found, they always said how grateful they were that there was not a chance to hear other people's views and benefit from the experiences of faithful from all corners of the globe. But surprisingly, many also appreciated the novelty introduced at the Synod of what was called conversation in the Spirit, saying it helped them to listen to one another and keep at bay activists such as Father James Martin, who was also a Synod member appointed directly by the Pope. Archbishop Timothy Broglio, president of the USCCB, said how much he valued the opportunity to listen. And one bishop told me there was a lot of effort to stop any bust-ups at the Synod, but also it also stopped the spirit of activism. Now others, it should be said, felt that the conversation in the Spirit was used to hijack the arguments, and it did seem to mean, I thought, a sort of an attempt to shut down the polemics of the debate so that heterodoxy could get through effectively unopposed. But perhaps some good came of it too. Now, as for the content of the discussions, one bishop said that issues that really matter, such as mission, how to reach non-Catholics, essentially those matters clearly pertaining directly to the salvation of souls, which of course is the Church's chief role, were not covered at the Synod. We've preached a worldly salvation, one bishop said, with tangible sadness. And he added, we're constantly being told that we shouldn't be self-referential, but that's what we're being. And although statements were made upholding apostolic tradition and divine revelation, I was told that doctrine and morality were hardly raised at the assembly at all. By contrast, efforts to introduce heterodoxy and radical reform certainly were, and these were very passionately put forward. Now, what's been termed a revolution was manifested most notably in the set speeches of those in charge, as well as a handful of testimonials from specially selected participants. Those were, of course, published and given to the press. Now, I won't go into all of those here, but the statements coming from Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, the General Relator of the Synod, Father Dario Vitali, who was the coordinator of expert theologians, and an assortment of liberal laity and post-conciliar liberal theologians made it clear that a revolution was underway to turn the Church into something clearly apart from apostolic tradition and divine revelation. You had Archbishop Shane McKinley, for example, of Sandhurst, Australia, who's an ardent supporter of women's ordination, and he was one of those chosen to address the assembly. And he wasted no time in pushing for greater leadership roles for women in the Church, obviously with a view to pushing forward women's ordination. Then you had Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe, effectively the Synod's spiritual guru. Regularly he spoke at the assembly, as well as bombarding the delegates with modernist thinking in a series of talks at a retreat held in the days before the Synod. Now, Father Radcliffe, who's very much in favor of homosexual rights in the Church, gave 3 spiritual talks, more than any other delegate. And one Synod member joked that he manipulated us into his way of thinking, and we knew it. But they listened to him anyway. They had to. Father Vitali gave, I think, what many considered to be the most significant and revolutionary address, in which he said that when we reach the consensus that the Church is constitutively synodal, we will have to rethink the whole Church, all the institutions, the whole life of the Church in a synodal sense. Note that he said when, not if. Now, upending the Church hierarchy was a key theme of the Synod, even if not explicitly, and even going into the event, as was emphasizing the equal dignity of the laity and the ordained ministry. So the fact that for centuries the Church has considered the dignity of the priesthood to be the highest of all dignities was conveniently forgotten. Now, to make a personal observation here, when I visited the Synod Hall on 3 occasions, because we were let in the press just for the morning prayer, which was about 15 minutes each day, you could see that everyone was seated around round tables, including the Pope, and it struck me how highly egalitarian the whole meeting was. There was nothing to really convey hierarchy. They didn't want to convey the hierarchy at all. So you had priests and prelates who were asked not to wear their cassocks or robes. And so only Cardinal Müller made a point of wearing his cardinalatial attire, and he did so every day because he said he felt it was appropriate for the circumstance. Now, like the preset speeches, the press conferences too were carefully choreographed. Delegates with the same talking points were rolled out, usually emphasizing the same points of listening, welcome, and accompaniment. One went so far as to call on the faithful to kneel not before God, but before the women of Africa. And then you had Cardinal Franz Joseph Overbeck of Essen unashamedly calling for apostolic tradition to be set aside. You occasionally had some who were willing to voice some orthodox opinions and criticism, but mostly they were progressive, and you even had a communist activist close to Sant'Egidio, Luca Casarini, who helps illegal migrants in the Mediterranean. It was interesting what he said, but again, you got clearly a defined, clear ideological position being put forward. And of course, Cardinal Müller was never asked to appear in front of the press, so that tells you a lot, I think. A few other points to make. The German synodal way was seen as certainly a forerunner of the event, and that frightened some but was useful to others, according to at least one delegate I spoke to. And unlike previous synods, I thought it was interesting there was no adoration chapel set up for the participants. No one seemed to know also exactly how the synod was being funded. Certainly bishops' conferences paid for a lot of the costs, but other costs remained unclear. And also interesting that lunch wasn't provided, so perhaps there was a shortage of funding, I don't know. So what were the results of the assembly, especially the crucial summary or synthesis report, this 42-page document that will act as the lineamenta or the guidance document for the next October's assembly? First of all, it's important to point out that it's highly unlikely that such a lengthy draft text presented in the final week, which was as long as the final report, could have been written during the synodal assembly. So the draft was most probably written before, as many people predicted, and was perhaps based on reports of the previous stages or the Instrumentum Laboris. The authors of the summary report, whom the Vatican adamantly refused to disclose, so I had to go and find out independently, were the two synod special secretaries, Father Giacomo Costa of Italy, who headed the synthesizing task force for the continental stage of the synod last year, and Monsignor Riccardo Battocchio, an Italian theologian. Both had taken a public interest, by the way, in supporting homosexual issues. Then you had two other authors, English professor Anna Rowlands and Irish priest Father Eamon Conway. And then the document was assessed by a 13-member synthesizing commission comprising, among others, Cardinal Hollerich, Cardinal Grech, and Archbishop McKinley. Another example, if needed, of how the deck had been stacked in favor of, if not a specific agenda, then a clear outcome. Now, I won't go into all the amendments, you'll be glad to hear, because there were 1,251 of them. But among the most noticeable was the excision of the term LGBTQ, despite it being in both the Instrumentum Laboris and in a different form in the initial draft. This was, it turns out, taken out largely thanks to the African bishops for taking a stand. I did an interview with Archbishop Andrea Nkea of Cameroon, which you may have seen, in which he said, "In Africa, we understand marriage as a union between man and a woman, and anything short of that is witchcraft." Given the sound approach to marriage and family in Africa, he said it would have been impossible for him to take such a change back to his flock. But the German bishops admitted with some satisfaction, and this is quite revealing, I think, paragraph 15G, which can be read as effectively giving the go-ahead for further normalization of homosexuality in the Church. It cleverly obscures the issue by lumping matters together relating to sexuality with end-of-life issues, complicated marital situations, and ethical issues related to artificial intelligence, saying they all raise new questions. Sometimes, the report goes on, the anthropological categories we have developed are not able to grasp the complexity of the elements emerging from experience or knowledge in the sciences, and require greater precision and further study. The paragraph goes on, it's important to take the time required for this reflection and to invest our best energies in it without giving in to simplistic judgments that hurt individuals and the body of the Church. Church teaching already provides a sense of direction of many of these matters, but this teaching evidently still requires translation into pastoral practice. Now again, we see how those wanting to normalize homosexuality and these other false teachings that are being put forward, they know that a change of doctrine isn't possible, but a change of pastoral practice is. And so that's the goal, just as it was with the Amoris Laetitia, which you may remember when they tried to put through communion for civilly remarried divorcees. This is the way they did it. It's to change pastoral practice. And interestingly, there's no mention of sin, the sin of such activity, of course. In fact, sin is mentioned only once in the summary report, in the context of eradicating the sin of racism. No wonder then that Bishop Georg Betzing, head of Germany's bishops, said the final text was a big step forward for the universal Church, even if it means a revision of Catholic sexual ethics, something he called an enormous step forward. Elsewhere, removed from the draft report, was a proposal to establish a permanent synod of bishops, a kind of super synod, elected by bishops' conferences to support the Petrine ministry. Instead, there's a proposal not all that different to make the C9 group of cardinals advising the Pope a synodal council, possibly expanding it to include the laity. Also of interest is a proposal to consider whether it's appropriate to ordain prelates of the Roman Curia as bishops, possibly another instance of decoupling episcopal ordination from church governance, which has been a priority of this pontificate. So again, this seems to be the part of this restructuring of the Church's governance which they want to enact through this synod. On the issue of a women's diaconate, the report calls for publication by the next assembly of the results of 2 commissions on the subject established by Pope Francis. Also, despite the fact that a women's sacramental diaconate is being impossible, it's just simply not possible. The Church can't agree to that. And Pope St. John Paul II effectively closed that argument down for that reason. The report calls for research to continue. It also speaks of an urgent need for canon law to be changed in order to allow more female governance roles. Now, hidden in the text and widely overlooked also is a call for, and it was under the heading of Eucharistic hospitality, for a broader reflection on interchurch marriages. Now, what this means is effectively opening the door to the possibility of a Protestant spouse, for example, married to a Catholic, receiving Holy Communion, so not becoming a Catholic first, but staying Protestant. Now, this is something the German bishops have pushed for years. And indeed, ecumenism figures highly in the document, but like interreligious dialogue, no mention is made of the uniqueness of the Catholic Church as the one true religion and instrument of salvation, and the need to accept her teaching to receive Holy Communion. Another paragraph of concern is a call to make liturgical language more embodied in the diversity of cultures, giving bishops' conferences a greater say. One liturgist told me that those who have despised for 20 years agencies like ISIL are having their moment, and that he expects they will soon have their own playbook. So what does this all mean? Well, let's first say that reports claiming that the Synod wasn't anything to be concerned about and is a bit of a nothing burger, I think are highly misleading. All the controversial issues, whether they be homosexuality, women deacons, reform of church governance, they're all still very much on the table. They may not have been presented as forthrightly as some might have expected, but then again, that would have strategically been a mistake. If you're going to do something illicit or underhand, You don't want to scare the horses and draw attention to your plans. All must be done slowly and quietly, so that when people finally wake up to realize what's been done, it's too late. Indeed, when looking at the summary report, one sees a number of time bombs, if you like, ready to go off at the next assembly, or in Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, not only related to the issues I've mentioned, but more generally. Let's take one paragraph of the report. It says that synodal processes enhance the gift of knowing the truth of the faith, allowing the existence of that consensus of the faithful, consensus fidelium, to be confirmed. This process provides a sure criterion for determining whether a particular doctrine or practice belongs to the apostolic faith. So in other words, they're saying that if there's consensus, and let's recall the synod members are all largely heterodox, then that's a sure criterion that it belongs to the faith. In another paragraph, it says, in order to avoid repeating vacuous formulas, which code word really means the teachings of the church, I suppose, we need to provide an opportunity for a dialogue involving the human and social sciences, as well as philosophical and theological reflection. Now, Gavin Ashenden, who you may know is a Catholic convert, a former Anglican bishop, who's obviously seen all this before in the Church of England, he said both these paragraphs give the green light to take the lead from the world and its secular perspectives, rather than from apostolic tradition and the perennial magisterium of the Church. One has seen this approach taken countless times during this pontificate, notably in new statutes, whether they be the Pontifical Academy for Life, the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Marriage and the Family, or most recently you may have seen these new statutes that the Pope has put out through a motu proprio for the Pontifical Academy of Theology. Also, it's important to point out that it's the process that's most significant to the revolutionaries in this. As a delegate told the Tablet, quite revealingly, he said the progressives got the process at the Synod and the conservatives got the content. Now, the process of synodality is a Hegelian concept, according to Professor Fontana, who said this at a speech in Rome last month. Excuse me. He said it's geared towards transforming the Church not from without, but from within, introducing philosophical categories into theology to revolutionize it so that it would be Catholic theology that would deform itself. A Dominican theologian told me that synodality is so important to them because it implies there's no such thing as stable doctrine. Instead, he said, it's determined by people's immediate whim, and the democratization of the Church removes apostolic authority to teach. That's the embedded meaning of the process, he said, and he compared it to a factory producing a certain good. It can't produce just any material. It produces what it was designed to make in the first place. So the process, he said, has only one specific outcome. For this reason, he didn't think it would open a Pandora's box of different heresies, but merely what they always wanted, and what they've already effectively announced, which is the blessings of same-sex unions, women's ordination, communion for all, etc. He said it's not a process that's going to lead to more Latin masses, for example, or to deny the Trinity, because it wasn't designed to do that, but rather achieve a more generalist, modernist, deist church, one that is ultimately opposed to the Trinitarian incarnational church founded by Christ. It'll have no strict dogmas or morals, but end up looking like the Anglican Church. Now, this is very similar to what Cardinal Muller told me shortly before the end of the Synod. The process, he contended, is all designed to prepare us to accept homosexuality and the ordination of women. And he added that some speakers had a sociological, naturalistic understanding of the Church, rather than a supernatural or theological one. Of course, much of this was clear early on in this pontificate. I think it was obvious to those with eyes to see that it was set up, the first two synods on the family, towards achieving a preset agenda. They made mistakes, though, at that synod by showing their hand too soon. And with each synod under Francis, they have learned to get their agenda through without less notice. It's been a self-ameliorating process, a German church expert told me, who added that German bishops and their synodal path have been key players in all of this. They played it very strategically, he said, and got what they wanted, hosting behind-the-scenes meetings, inviting bishops to dinners, avoiding negative attention. And now they can say the things they're now discussing in Rome are the same as what we've been discussing. So they can portray themselves now as being ahead of the game. He also said they have learned from their mistakes that they made in the synodal way. Not their doctrinal errors, of course, but to be quiet and not outspoken, to build networks ready for the next synodal assembly. Their way of thinking, this German church expert said, is let's opt for an ambivalent statement. If our position is not condemned, then fine, we can live with it, and they'll go on to achieve their goal. Also, as Bishop Betzing and others talk about the importance of science to back up their new sexual ethics, they don't ever give scientific proof of this, and because none exist, of course. Another interesting aspect to all of this is that the process has effectively suspended the bishop's munera of teaching. One said the priestly role is being obliterated. Now perhaps that's hyperbole, but one gets the point. It was possible to see this early on in the synod when I asked an African bishop at the synod's, one of the synod press conferences whether he would accept if the synod supported the blessing of same-sex unions as the will of God. Now the bishop, Cardinal Basungu of Kinshasa, demurred and he refused to teach what the church has always taught and said instead that the Lord himself, through collective discernment, will tell us what direction the church needs to take. Now, in a way, it's interesting that this is reminiscent of Cardinal John Henry Newman's account of the Arian crisis. He wrote, "There was a temporary suspense of the functions of the ecclesia docens, the teaching church. The body of bishops failed in their confession of the faith. They spoke variously, one against the other. There was nothing after Nicaea of firm, unvarying, consistent testimony for nearly 60 years." The German expert I spoke to put it this way. He said, "Before we trusted bishops to make the right decisions and defend the faith, now others are telling the bishops what to do. And wherever there's consensus that comes out of the synodal process, that will now be the faith. That will be what is true, not what the successors of the apostles teach." It's the approach, he said, of Jürgen Habermas, referring to the atheist German philosopher and social theorist. But such a consensus approach, he added, is a devilish work. There's a peaceful resistance, but conveyed as a consensus of opinion. It's a psychological method of disarming all those who don't agree with the revolution. The revolution will do immense damage to the church, he went on. We won't get more people entering seminary, more people getting married, more people catechized, because the church is in a state of suspension. And all the time the process is destroying the church. The longer it drags on, the more poisonous it becomes. And the more the organ gets increasingly poisoned, the harder it is to cure. It rests in the body, and a detox of the body will take a long time. So humanly speaking, he said, it's going to get worse. All these things are going to get worse, he said, and the train won't stop until it hits a wall. And perhaps that wall will be some kind of divine intervention. Cardinal Müller told the New Daily Compass last week that the criteria of Catholic ecclesiology has been lost. It's not said openly, but the path that has been taken is that of Protestantization. Perhaps it's no surprise then that I heard that at least 25 bishops had no wish to come back to the final session next October. But should we really be worried? Because aren't we guaranteed that the Church will not be led into error? Won't the Holy Spirit prevent the Pope in his apostolic exhortation, a post-synodal apostolic exhortation, from allowing any of this, just as Francis backed down, if you remember, after the Amazon Synod, from allowing women deacons and married clergy when most delegates voted in support of them. The Dominican theologian I quoted earlier said that we have to define what the term led into error means. He said that we're discovering that God's promise that the Church cannot be led into error is narrower than we thought. Seeing as the Pope is clearly making erroneous statements, some would say heretical, when many thought that would be impossible. He also pointed out that some synods of the past were heretical, and even some councils were condemned by popes. Could this synod proclaim something heretical, he asked? Yes, it could, but it wouldn't undermine God's promise to the Church. So I asked him what would happen if the Pope signed off on a post-synodal apostolic exhortation that contains such heresy. His response would be that would be a situation like Pope Honorius I or John the 22nd, both of whom were found guilty of proclaiming or defending heresy, material or formal heresy. And he firmly expected Francis's pontificate to end the same way unless there's some divine intervention in the meantime. But this is important, I think. He stressed that the error of heresy would be confined primarily to Rome and the Roman Curia, and they're not synonymous with the Catholic Church. It's necessary, he said, for the faithful to look beyond those institutions so they retain their faith even if those institutions collapse, which seems increasingly likely. By excluding apostolic tradition, he said, the progressives are essentially cutting off the branch that they're sitting on. They're killing their own authority by proclaiming heresy and pursuing a deeper culture of death than the one John Paul II warned us about. The German church expert made a similar point. He said that the enemy has entered the vineyard to discover it's totally empty. They've conquered it, but all the life that used to fill it has gone. They've conquered the citadel, but the people have left. So they're left by themselves, like a parasite feeding on a living being, and they will die when the being dies. And it has to die because the answer is not to rescue something that is rotten. It has to fail, as all liberal institutions eventually do. And they fail and die because they have no spirit of life within them. So to conclude, it's perhaps obvious that the Synod of Synodality, by drawing on the world's thinking rather than the Church and her apostolic tradition, is unlikely to be the source of a new springtime of evangelization. It may help the Church in some areas, and perhaps some good will come of it, and has come of it. But among those I spoke to at the Synod and elsewhere in Rome, there was little optimism that this will win more souls to Christ. On the contrary, what I found was a conviction among learned theologians, bishops, and others, as those I've quoted before, that ultimately it poses a great danger to the Church and the integrity of her teaching, perhaps the greatest danger she's ever faced, at least as far as Rome is concerned. Also, one question, speaking just as a journalist and observer, that keeps coming back to me about these synods, and indeed this pontificate in general, is that how can these processes, even if we suppose they're backed by good intentions, lead to any sustainable and lasting good if the way they're carried out is largely based on lies, deceit, and sophistry? We've seen this dynamic throughout this pontificate, and it's produced the thorny fruit of contention, division, and ultimately destruction. And for all the Pope's talk about mission and his wish for a church that looks outward, well, I think we can all agree the Church seems more self-referential and inward-looking than ever. As well as the call for prayer and penance that we often are called to do, perhaps the answer is for faithful Catholics to devise and promote an alternative synodal model and process, one that takes as its starting point apostolic tradition, divine revelation, and the magisterium, rather than secular thinking, science, and subjective experience. Because at the moment, those secular values are in the ascendant, and perhaps unless resisted, they seem likely to fully conquer Rome if they haven't done so already. Thank you for listening.